Right, so there's a certain audacity in calling it peace while the shells are still falling, isn't there? Israel's ceasefire is still being sold to the world as a turning point, but in Gaza, the only thing that's turned was the camera fixed on those hostage exchanges. Going unreported and unseen by comparison is the fact that the drones were still there, that people are still being killed by Israel, and many of the hostages Israel were releasing were being exiled instead of freed, all whilst Israeli ministers were already promising the next phase of destruction. Even Donald Trump flew in to deliver a sermon to the Knesset, congratulating Israel for a genocide it still hasn't actually stopped fighting. The word ceasefire has rarely been so abused. What's being presented as closure is turning out to be a bureaucratic rebranding of genocide for Western audiences, desperate to believe the nightmare was over. Gaza is still burning. The only thing that has actually ceased was what passed for Western scrutiny. Right, so Israel called it a ceasefire. Western governments called it a breakthrough. But in Gaza, the genocide still hasn't actually stopped. The guns have slowed, sure, but they're still being used. The cameras have moved on, but the killing has continued. The truce signed was marketed as the end of a 2-year campaign, yet it still hasn't actually ended yet. Still, supposedly 4 days into the ceasefire period now. By the time Israel's cabinet ratified the ceasefire deal, Gaza's human toll had already surpassed 66,000 dead. Likely many more than that, with so many people still unaccounted for. More than 20,000, of course, were children. The UN's humanitarian office confirmed that roughly 4/5 of all homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Every single essential service, water, electricity, sanitation, has collapsed. These numbers are not disputed. They appear in official UN situation reports and form the factual baseline for any discussion of what Israel now calls peace. Yet despite the ceasefire having supposedly taken effect, some of the most recent attacks on Gaza by Israel include Israeli quadcopters firing on civilians in the Al-Shajaya neighborhood as people inspected the ruins of their homes, another 3 people being killed there. Israeli artillery hit parts of Jabalia and Al-Tarans. Tanks and small arms fire echoed in Khan Yunis. Aid convoys waiting at Rafah delayed because of what UN officials have described as security incidents. The evidence of ongoing warfare and genocide seem pretty obvious and nailed on, therefore. But the pattern's not new, is it? Every single Israeli ceasefire of the last decade has ended the same way. Violence reduced to a slower rhythm, then resumes later on trumped-up reasoning, and there we go again. As I covered in a video just yesterday, Defence Minister Israel Katz has already stated publicly that the great challenge ahead was the destruction of Hamas's tunnels, and confirmed that he had already instructed the army to prepare. That order was issued as the ceasefire had barely begun. It's not a misstatement, it was policy. Ceasefire on paper, genocide will continue in practice. When a state begins a ceasefire by issuing new military orders, the truce is not a pause in violence, it's a rearming period disguised as diplomacy. If this is what Israel calls peace, then what does war look like? The moral arithmetic of the conflict has always been selective, though. Israel and its allies built their case around those 251 hostages taken by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. Their stories filled broadcasts for months. When the last living captives were released just yesterday, the coverage was celebratory. But the other side of the equation, the Palestinians held by Israel, was treated as administrative detail, not a humanitarian one. Israel announced that around 2,000 Palestinian detainees were freed under the agreement. The figure sounds generous until it's placed beside the 9,000 who very much remain in Israeli custody. Of those, roughly 3,000 are held under administrative detention. No charges, no trial, indefinite renewals. These are documented figures from prison rights groups and Israel's own public defender. Administrative detention is not an emergency measure. It's a governing tool inherited from the British Mandate and normalised through decades of occupation. Over 1 million Palestinians have passed through Israeli prisons since 1967, when Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine began. Every single family, be it in Gaza or the West Bank, has known imprisonment. The scale alone exposes the fiction that these are isolated security cases. Testimonies from those newly released show what that system means in practice, though. Prisoners describe routine beatings, starvation diets, and denial of medical care. Some left custody weighing 20 or 30 kilos less than when they entered. Others emerged unable to walk. Detainees reported months in solitary confinement, exposed to extreme cold, and being told through loudspeakers that their families had died in Gaza. And that's not including all of those who have died in Israeli detention, of course. Israel's Public Defender's Office has confirmed severe overcrowding and inhumane conditions across multiple facilities. The UN Committee Against Torture has cited Israel repeatedly for these violations. The suffering inside Israel's prisons is not collateral damage, it's all part of the system's design. The mass release serves public relations, not justice. Every freed body testifies to the cruelty of the machine that still holds thousands more. But that's a story we never hear in the West. We just hear about those 251 taken on that night of October 7th, 2023, as if everything began on that date. Well, they're all free now. The same can't be said of a further 9,000 Palestinians. I bet they still won't make the news, though. However, hidden inside Israel's prisoner list was the most revealing clause of the ceasefire, because amongst those supposedly released were at least 154 Palestinians who are still not allowed to return home at all, because they're being deported. Families were informed that their relatives would be sent to third countries. Egypt, for the most part, apparently. The one nation that built its defences solidly in the Sinai Alps, so massively, in fact, so afraid of a Palestinian incursion, were they? And yet they are taking these exiles in for the most part, and denied re-entry to Gaza or the West Bank. Among them is Nail Barghouti, the longest-serving Palestinian hostage, held by Israel for 44 years. Others included detainees from the 1980s and 1990s who had become symbols of endurance. Under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the forcible transfer or deportation of protected persons from occupied territory is illegal regardless of motive. Yet Israel reframed expulsion as a security condition and, as per usual, are getting away with it. International law set aside once more for Israel's whims. Exile is demographic strategy masquerading as compromise. By removing political veterans and community leaders, Israel achieved a quiet cleansing anyway. Leadership stripped without gunfire, displacement disguised as release. A release of exiles is not freedom, it is deportation by another name. Even within its own declared framework, Israel has reneged on the deal by doing this. Several prominent detainees expected to be freed were kept in custody. Nail Barghouti's case was reclassified for security reasons. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the paediatrician seized during that army raid on the Camel Adwan hospital, has been excluded from being freed entirely. Why are Israel holding him at all? International medical organisations have appealed for his release. None have succeeded. At least 60 health workers remain imprisoned. For what? Daring to treat people? These omissions were deliberate. Israel freed those whose release served optics and kept those whose freedom was symbolised defiance. While Gaza buries its dead, Donald Trump stood in the Knesset and declared victory, though, didn't he? In what it was a quite sickening and sycophantic display. Just yesterday he told Israeli lawmakers that the Gaza war has now ended and that Israel has won all that it can by force of arms, and the chamber applauded him. Yet two parliamentarians, Ayman Odeh and Ofer Kassif, shouted genocide at him and were removed by security. These were elected officials. These were the voices of their constituents being denied. Israeli democracy really is a sick joke. International reaction came swiftly too. Commentators across multiple networks called the speech grotesque, which it was, accusing Trump of celebrating mass death, which he did. None of his remarks mentioned Gaza's civilian toll or the starvation crisis. Instead, he praised Israel's resilience and urged for a pardon for Netanyahu over his corruption case. The performance reframed destruction as achievement and immunity as justice. This was the moment the whole illusion of peace collapsed. The Knesset speech was not diplomacy, it was absolution. A foreign president granted moral immunity to an ally still killing under a truce. Since the ceasefire announcement, Israeli operations have continued daily. The strikes in Al-Shujaya, in Jabalia, in Khan Yunis and elsewhere too are just the latest visible breaches, but they won't be the last. Not at this rate. UN agencies report persistent security incidents delaying those aid deliveries. Israeli officials call them defensive actions. That phrase converts aggression into maintenance. Each incident is treated as an exception until exceptions end up defining the rule. And then where are we? Another broken ceasefire. When killing civilians no longer breaks a ceasefire, the ceasefire has no meaning at all. Because a management phase between bombardments, war slowed down just to preserve the optics. Peace is public relations. Mass detention is not an emergency tactic, it's the spine of the occupation. The first ever prisoner swap took place all the way back in 1968 when 3 Israeli soldiers were swapped for 37 Palestinians, and every decade since has repeated that cycle. The statistics are consistent. About 1 million Palestinians arrested since 1967, more than 100,000 administrative detention orders issued in that time, 9,000 still behind bars today. Most are held inside Israel rather than in occupied territory as well, which is itself a direct violation of international humanitarian law. They've been kidnapped effectively by another state. Generations have grown up with imprisonment as a certainty of life. Families learn to navigate permits and prison visits like bureaucratic rites of passage. The state's control over movement and custody is total. Israel's carceral system is not about preventing violence, it's about governing a population through fear and absence. Every arrest reasserts ownership of the occupied body. Benjamin Netanyahu's survival depends on permanent crisis, and we know this, of course. His coalition partners, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, insist that any pause before the total destruction of Hamas would bring down the government, because they would ensure that. They would bring it down. Netanyahu himself remains under criminal indictment, despite Trump's efforts to get him off the hook. Wartime unity keeps his trials dormant, though. Peace would end that shield. For him, conflict is the condition of power. Israel Katz's directive to prepare for new operations proves that the military never demobilized, and there's actually no intention of that. The ongoing blockade of Gaza breaches the humanitarian clauses of the truce, but continues unchecked. The mediators, Qatar, Egypt, the US, have all issued no rebuke at all. The Knesset spectacle and US endorsement turned the truce into diplomatic cover. American military aid continues at roughly $4 billion annually. None of that has been suspended. Washington frames this support as shared democratic values, a phrase that replaces oversight with sentiment. The International Criminal Court has opened investigations into Gaza, but they've issued no further indictments since the issuance of arrest warrants for Netanyahu himself and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The International Court of Justice ordered Israel to prevent genocidal acts and ensure aid access, but the order remains completely unenforced. The blockade persists, aid trickles in, and the courts just deliberate. 66,000 dead, 20,000 children, 150,000 wounded. Every figure represents a life, all reduced to just raw data. Hospitals operate on generator fuel. Performing amputations without anaesthetic, as still no medical aid has entered at all. In Rafah and Deir al-Balah, survivors live in ruins classified by Israel as neutralised areas. Electricity and clean water remain intermittent. The so-called ceasefire has changed none of that. Released prisoners describe identical methods of humiliation across facilities: the beatings, the forced standing, the mock executions, denial of medical care. The phrase slaughterhouse recurs in separate testimonies from different prisons. That consistency indicates system, not accident. Israel's governance of Palestinians, whether through siege or detention, all follows the same logic. Control life just enough to avoid the word death, and then just call it security. Western media narratives sustain that illusion of progress too. The framing is uniform. Israel responds while Hamas violates. Released Palestinians are security detainees. Bombings become operations. These linguistic shifts are deliberate. They translate occupation and genocide into bureaucracy. By contrast, regional outlets continue to document the shelling and the mass displacement, but even their existence gets denied by some in politics and the press. The disparity reveals not different facts, but different permissions. When states supply the weapons, their press supplies the covering grammar. The continuity from colonial emergency law to modern Israeli detention is direct. The same regulations the British used prior to 1948 still underpin Israel's legal authority to detain without trial. The occupation's endurance relies on this continuity. The prison replaces the camp. The permit replaces the passbook. The individual case becomes the system's legitimacy. The occupation has evolved from territorial control to carceral management. Imprisonment is not a byproduct, it is the mechanism that sustains the illusion of order. This latest ceasefire has turned legal vocabulary into theatre. Self-defense now justifies collective punishment. Proportionality measures destruction by Western patience rather than by law. The acts documented in Gaza, the mass killing, the starvation, the displacement, the deportations now, they all fit the UN's definition of genocide. Yet governments refuse to use the term in too many cases. The semantics of denial have replaced moral clarity. But then for many, morality no longer has anything to do with it, more than their own complicity does. When the world calls this a ceasefire, it teaches that war crimes can be paused for applause. Each violation unpunished becomes precedent. International humanitarian law, once conceived as universal restraint, now functions as selective permission. Behind every statistic is a visible survivor. In Gaza's camps, families sift through rubble where homes once stood. In Israel's prisons, 9,000 people remain either without trial or found guilty under another state's laws. freed detainees return to demolished neighbourhoods if they get to return at all, if they haven't been exiled abroad. The separation between prison and enclave is dissolved. Both are zones of control where Israel regulates existence by its own decree, and the world applauds. None of this would be sustainable without external partnership. The United States, the United Kingdom, Europe all continue to fund, arm and defend Israel diplomatically. Statements of concern replace action. Arms contracts proceed. Trade flows. The international order built to prevent atrocities now subsidizes them. Complicity has replaced neutrality. Western governments are no longer observers of Israeli actions. They are its co-authors. When words lose their meaning, accountability becomes impossible. Ceasefire now describes ongoing attacks. Release now means exile. Humanitarian corridor now means checkpoint. The international system no longer prevents genocide, it manages the paperwork instead. The language of peace has been weaponized to disguise annihilation. For more on Israel's declared intent to go back in to collapse the Hamas tunnels, many of which have been proven over the course of the last 2 years to not exist at all in order to justify attacking certain targets. Hospitals spring to mind for me on this, as I'm sure they do for you. Do check out this declared announcement by Defence Minister Israel Katz in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.